We're your Verizon Wireless team at Locust Grove.
We support TV 18.
And we love life around the lake.
Welcome to Love Hair Studio. Hi, I'm Melissa.
And I'm Darlene.
We support Channel 18.
And we love life around the lake.
Hi, we're Diane and Keith Morris from Integrity Automotive.
And we support TV 18 and love life around the lake.
Hey, welcome to another edition of Meet Your Neighbor here. We're certainly glad that you've joined us. You know, we've introduced you to a lot of interesting people, and we're just not running out of great stories because we certainly have a good one for you today. With my friend Sam Thomsen. Many of you know Sam, and we're going to find out about his story and much more right here on Meet Your Neighbor. So don't you dare go away, because today the story's all about you. Hey, welcome back. Again, we're glad you've joined us. Sam Thomsen is an interesting man. He's a man that I've sat next to for several months in a Bible study group that we attend here at Lake of the Woods Church. And little do we know about each other. Our circles have gone in many different directions, haven't they?
They have.
Wow. And you're an old Norwegian from Minnesota.
Yeah. Been coming from Minnesota.
but young enough that you didn't stay there very long, did you?
That's right. Just until I was 10 years old. I was born in 31 and lived there during the Depression in a country home, a little farm my grandfather owned, and enjoyed life in a place that I love to remember. But in 1941, we moved to California. My dad needed to get a job after the Depression, and so.
Did you find growing up on a farm, though, in that early life, did you see yourself following the family tradition and being a farmer? Or was that something just you were raised in?
Well, actually, my grandfather, who had the farm, was a railroader. He'd come from Norway in 1879 as a 17-year-old to escape the Swedish draft, of all things, and found Minnesota and worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week, and bought property near one of the railroad stations, which he then threw the switch on for the rest of his life. I'm sure he was paid something by the railroad, but twice a day he'd walk across the street, throw the switch, and come back and milk the cow or feed the chickens. And I followed him around as a 3 to 5-year-old. Unfortunately, he died when I was 5, but I loved the man and loved being with him.
So by the time you're 10, and now you go from the tundras of Minnesota to the palm trees of Southern California.
And the beaches.
Oh, and the beaches. Can't leave the beaches out. Yeah, there's not many beaches in Minnesota, is there? Once you got to California, you got there in a very interesting time in history because it was just prior to the war, wasn't it?
Right. You know, we got there in July and the war, of course, in December.
Do you remember much about that events as they were taking place during those
times? In fact, we do. I had two uncles who were in the Navy, had been in the Navy since the 30s. They'd traveled all over the world and brought back gifts to us kids from China, from other places. So we knew that there was things going on. And my younger brother and I can remember, bought the wood and created a little .50 caliber machine gun model. And on December 7, when we heard about Pearl Harbor, we went out in the backyard and got our little wooden .50 caliber machine gun and pointed it up in the air to shoot down whoever might show up as a bad guy.
Waiting for the enemy.
Yep.
But America kind of did that all across the country, didn't they? Didn't they respond kind of in the same way with a real sense of let's get into it, patriotism?
That's absolutely right. My youngest uncle joined the Marines the next day to be with his brothers. And so we followed them through the war. Neither of the two sailors were in Pearl Harbor, but they were on ships that fought the war in the Pacific. And the younger uncle with the Marines was a waist gunner on a B-24. Wow. And they came back with stories as time went on, yeah.
Well, the good news is they all came back.
They all came back, absolutely.
Do you think those stories, I mean, we're getting into generations now that we're in the 21st century. I mean, that was almost 100 years ago. It feels
right.
like, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
But it really was almost 80 years ago that this happened. Are we losing those stories? I mean, not just because the people are leaving, but are we losing the narrative that caused all those things and happened then?
I'm not sure I know what you mean, but if you mean that we don't have the same attitude generally in the nation, I think we are. Being patriotic isn't the same thing as it was when I was a boy and when we were supporting our troops. But on the other hand, and I was in Viet Nam, and I do remember with the Foreign Service, I do remember that the troops came back and they were not well treated. But I do see that there's been a change in that our troops are being honored now as they were during the Second World War, more than as they were disdained during the Vietnam War.
And the Korean War is almost a forgotten war. It's not even talked about much anymore. But
That's right.
It was a huge event, though.
It was for me. I spent a year in Korea, and at the same, and associated with that, another year in Japan. But I was in Korea before the war ended, and I was back in Korea after the war ended in 1953. And when I came home, no one even knew where Korea was still.
The times between World War II and the times that we live in today, the military's changed as well as politics have. But you were in the Army during the Korean War, weren't you?
That's right. 51.
You attacked the North Koreans with a saxophone.
That's right. I was in the 7th Division Band in Korea, and we played for the troops. It was a morale builder, but we were also the security guard for the division headquarters. A division's made up of about 20,000 with a general commanding, and the band is a part of the division apparatus. But we also knew how to fire weapons, and we could stand if we had to, and we were able to provide protection for the general. Yeah.
How important are those kind of events where the bands play for the troops and are able to get out and entertain? How important are those things for people?
Well, given the reaction to us, it was pretty important. They enjoyed it, and there was a break for them. And the parades, of course, were associated with honors of various kinds that gave some seriousness to and importance to the event. So it was important. It's an ancient tradition for military to have musical, going back to the bagpipe for the Scots and even before that.
Well, we can go back further than that. It was the priest with the trumpets.
Yes, that's right.
From those old biblical days.
That's exactly right.
So did that look like it was going to be a career for you at that time?
At the time, I wanted to be a music teacher. That was what I intended to become. But it was the time in Korea that kind of alerted me or sensitized me to the fact that there's a big world out there and a dangerous one. And I decided I wanted to be a part of the organization that helped protect America through diplomacy. So I went back from the military to UCLA, studied international relations, and in time joined the Foreign Service.
Had your political nature already been established by the time you got to UCLA, or was that one of the things that really influenced you?
I was a conservative. Interestingly, I voted for the first time while I was in Japan, became 21, and voted for Eisenhower in the elections, but I tried to vote for a conservative party. California didn't have a conservative party, so I couldn't vote in the primaries, but I was able to vote for the hero of the Second World War, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Yay! Yeah. A Texan by birth, by the way. I just have to throw that in. Denison, Texas.
No.
Well, voting for Eisenhower, but then going to UCLA, I mean, if it's anything like it is now, it's so extremely extreme. Was it the same way in the 50s?
Well, it was called the Little Red Schoolhouse. And the week before I arrived, the young socialists one of the young socialists had murdered another one in an internecine battle for ideology. And I was very aware of that. But at UCLA, there were both conservative and liberal political science professors. So I did not feel that we were that extreme at the time. But now, as you say, it's gone over the edge. Yeah.
So you got a good balance of thinking during the days of
I
your
felt so.
education days.
Yeah, I felt so. And politics wasn't that important in the lives of the students or even the lives of the faculty. In retrospect, I felt good about UCLA at the time. I've thought about that later, especially in the context of the issues today, and it was a mild situation compared to today. Yeah.
And the difference is?
People got along in those days, even though they might have different views.
We also didn't have the availability of information then.
Well, that's right.
So
yeah.
that it wasn't even a point of conversation a lot, was
exactly.
it?
Yeah.
Life is where you live it, right?
Yeah.
Well, you go from the conservative years of Eisenhower, the post-war, America's on its way up, Levittown's being built, GIs are going to school, and we've got a whole new generation of leadership coming out of those million people who served in the military during the wars. Now you go to the Kennedy years. And you're getting out of school, and here's the ideology of the Kennedy, the young guys. How did that affect you?
Well, I must say that my colleagues in the Foreign Service were all much more liberal than I was. Our class started in October of '60, and the first television interviews or debates occurred then. And so our class of 40 individuals met to watch the first debate on television. And I and one lieutenant commander from the Navy, a lawyer, were the only two to vote for Nixon. The other 38 voted for Kennedy. On the other hand, once Kennedy was in office, we were delighted with him and his style. And Bobby Kennedy used to come by the State Department and engage with the young diplomats, and we appreciated that. So again, there wasn't this violent engagement or non-engagement between the two sides. We worked together more than we didn't. Yeah.
It was much more pragmatic than that.
Much more pragmatic and goal-oriented, and basically common goals in those days.
So before you got your first foreign assignment, what is the preparation for that?
Well, it's kind of interesting. Once I finished the basic course, the basic training course of 6
And where was that taught?
That was taught at what is called the Foreign Service Institute in Washington, D.C. And after that, I was given 6 weeks of French, introductory French. Then I was given an assignment in Washington. It was actually a very interesting one on what was called the management staff of the department, studying on issues and resolving issues of an organizational or procedural kind. But my first assignment was intended to be in Montreal, Canada, a French-speaking post, partly at least. But our President Kennedy decided he wanted an objective reporting on the situation in Vietnam. So he levied a requirement on the State Department that diplomatic officers, young diplomatic officers, be given Vietnamese language training and be placed in Vietnam to report in a way different from the intelligence community or the military community, to give a third view. So I was told I had put down Hindi as my hard language preference. So a senior Foreign Service officer in the personnel division called me down and said, well, you've put Hindi down. Vietnam is in the same continent as India, so we're going to give you Vietnamese instead of Hindi. So I studied Vietnamese for 9 months, 3 months in Saigon, and then began reporting from that perspective on a part of the, what was then simply an insurgency in 1963, 1964 in Vietnam. And that was pretty exciting.
So that far south, the war really hadn't gotten to that level yet, had it?
It was mainly what is called an insurgency, which meant that local insurgents recruited would harass, and but there was no real territory turned over, and it was not on a massive scale. I think we would say there are probably less than 20,000 insurgents in the entire part of South Vietnam.
But the language, that had to really be a tough one, huh?
The hardest part of the language was the tones. There were 5 tones in Vietnamese, and the grammar is very simple. It's what I call telegraphese. It's a very simple language structure. And the vocabulary was not difficult, but it was the pronouncing the tones that gotcha.
Do you still speak that language?
Tôi biết nói chút xíu thôi. I speak only a little.
I think that means yes. That's interesting. So you're in Vietnam, and you're in the early years before Tet, before the big military offensive begins, before LBJ really builds the war up. Were you part of the build-up?
Well, after a year in Saigon, reporting on the insurgency around Saigon, I was assigned to be the principal officer of our consulate in Hue, which is near the North Vietnamese border. And so in July of 1964, I was there and saw the first attack by North Vietnamese troops on a special forces camp south of Hue. And that began the buildup on the north side. And then in March of 1965, well, in January of 1965, we began responding to that event by sending aircraft north. It was called the Rolling Thunder operation. Dependents were evacuated, and we were now on a war footing. And in March, the Marines were the first American organized units, aside from the advisors that had been there before. The first units began arriving with the Marines. What was called the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force landed. And that buildup then increased over time until by the late 60s, we had tens of thousands of troops in South Vietnam.
I think 500,000 at one time.
500,000, 500,000, I'm sure. Yeah.
Grown that big.
Yeah.
Wow.
Several divisions. And my emphasis then moved from reporting on an insurgency, which was no longer the main event, but providing political advice. I became the political advisor to the commanding general of the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force, a man named Lewis Walt, Lieutenant General Lew Walt, who was a great man and who I really enjoyed working for.
Now, what does political advisor mean, though? I mean, is that how to get along with the folks back home and how to get the information there, or is it dealing with the politics of military command inside country?
Well, I think two main things. One is advising on the basis of my experience and training on the culture, the economics, the politics of the environment, helping. For example, the Marines brought in a chaplain, the chief of chaplains for the Pacific area, to meet with me over a period of about 2 weeks to do a simple manual for the young Marine troops on the Buddhist religion and how to avoid insulting or otherwise creating difficulties with the Buddhists. And that was a very useful process. On the other hand, then, and the other side is to become an interlocutor between the Marines and the local officials, ranging from the mayors of a city, the governors of a state, to the small hamlet leadership, and actually even to be a translator from time to time. But also during all of that, to provide my own analysis of the political situation in the area where the Marines operated.
And that information would go back to State Department here in Washington, and
it would go to the Commandant of the Marine Corps and to the Secretary of State, eyes only. So it was frank, and it's the best kind of information that we could provide. And that message would be introduced by the political situation, and then go on to carry on all of the Marine-style reporting that was required. So yes.
Yeah. Yes, a big job.
A big job.
A very important job, isn't it? I mean, that's this armchair quarterbacks. One day, the whole story.
One day, the general called me into his office, and he said, "President Johnson's on the phone, and he wants your opinion on the commanding general of the Vietnamese forces that we're working with." So I spent about 5 minutes with the President of the United States, giving my point of view. Now, the general, of course, had given his point of view, and we happened to be in sync, so that was a useful thing. Yeah.
Did the President ask interesting questions?
Yes, he did. Very frank, very direct questions, and they were operationally important questions, and I was delighted to be able to give him my first-hand view on a very important person in our Allied effort.
Well, once your assignments in Vietnam was over, then where did you go from there?
Well, kind of as a vacation, they sent me to Cornell for a year to study Southeast Asia, Southeast Asian history, politics, and economics. Cornell was a leading institution for that. Some of their professors were world renowned for their abilities and their knowledge, and that was a very useful and helpful year and a nice, relaxing time.
But so did you feel like that was still in preparation for something that was coming later? Was that the whole point?
That was the whole point, to become a Southeast Asia regional expert. And in fact, after I finished at Cornell, they sent me off to Vientiane, Laos. So immediate use of that training and education.
And that was still while the war was really raging then, wasn't it?
Well, 1967, 68, 69, and 70, the war was at its peak in Vietnam, and the war had lapped over into Laos over time, and of course what's so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail was in Laos. So there were a lot of connections between Laos and the war in Vietnam.
Was it easy to define the enemy once you got to Laos?
It was not difficult, yeah. The Pathet Lao, which was the communist Lao, which was really an offshoot of the Vietnamese Communist Party, and the Royal Lao Army, this was a fairly traditional war. They fought each other in armed units. And in parts of Laos, there were insurgencies, much like in Vietnam, but that was a small part of the war in Laos.
The economics of the whole Southeast Asia was completely shattered, though, during those times, wasn't it?
Well, it was very difficult. Laos was an insular country. It had no ocean contact. Thailand on the one side and Vietnam on the other side had, over the centuries, contended for Laos. So this was not, it was a part of an historical pattern. And the Thai were on our side. The Thai supported what we were doing in Laos. And we were assisting the Lao government in resisting the North Vietnamese and the Pathet Lao.
So we have the insurgents from the north coming in, and then we have in Laos, we have a civil war going on over territory.
Exactly.
And then another one in Cambodia. So there was really more than one war going on.
There were three wars going on at the same time, yeah.
And our participation was different in each one, wasn't it?
Exactly, yeah. We were very important to the Lao to give them what they needed to defend themselves. And I'm not familiar with Cambodia, but I think it was quite similar, yeah.
Sure. Now we've gotten through the 60s and ready to go back to playing music again, right? No, you prepared for something a little bigger than that.
Right.
What was your calling?
My calling? In faith?
In faith, it plays a part of it, but what is your calling? What was your calling in life? Were you able to recognize that you were being prepared for something, a destination that was going to be bigger than what you'd been in?
Well, I felt actually at the time that I was doing what I wanted to do, that is being a part of our diplomatic process in both in Vietnam and in Laos. That was an important role. In Laos, for example, I was the person who delivered the note to the North Vietnamese embassy in Vientiane, suggesting that we have conversation about how to end the war. And so we maintained that as the link with the North Vietnamese until the decision was made to operate out of Paris. And so at that point, the organization was created to operate directly with the North Vietnamese in Paris.
So you helped set those articles?
So I had a role to play in that. And I had a role to play in Vietnam, as I described already. So I felt that I was pursuing what I had set out to do, especially after my experience in Korea. I felt that the reason I had joined the diplomatic service was because of my experience in Korea, and I was able to operate on that basis. And then subsequently, after returning to the United States from Laos, I actually had an enjoyable year with the Marines again at Headquarters Marine Corps, working as a planning officer with them, and that was enjoyable, working with friends, people I'd worked with in Vietnam, and with younger officers who I had not known in Vietnam.
How is the State Department, how did it change through those years? You went in during the Kennedy era, and you came out in the Nixon era, right? When you were... Before you took the ambassadorship. We're going to get to that in just a second.
Okay, yeah.
Before that happened, but the State Department went through several heads through those years.
The State Department was pretty stable. It was on the liberal side, but the officers, the men and women who served in diplomatic positions really, I think, as I did, operate on the basis of the national interest as generally understood. Nothing like the polarization today. we were able to work and cooperate together, even though we might vote for a different president. Yeah.
Now, the war was over in 1975.
The war, yes. The war ended in 75, and
But the Paris Accord had been going on for like 3 years before that happened.
even longer than that. In fact, but the war, the American war, the American presence in the war ended in 1973 when the ceasefires was signed, and in the spring of in January of 1973, I was sent back to Vietnam for 6 months to assess along with 50 other language officers. We covered the country and tried to understand what was happening with the Vietnamese, and we also monitored what was called the International Control Commission, made up of representatives from Canada, Poland, and Indonesia, and I may be wrong on those countries. But that Control Commission was trying to separate the parties and to keep the peace. And so part of my responsibility, and I was in Da Nang at this time, not far from Hue, where I'd been before, reporting on the situation in that part of the country. And at that time, it seemed that peace might be able to be pursued, much like in Korea, where the dividing line was set and where the two sides were able to stay separated. But that did not happen.
Is it interesting to you that now, these 40 years after the war is over, our relationship with Vietnam and what it is now?
Well, it's kind of amazing. Of course, it's also similar, not dissimilar at all, from the situation with Japan and Germany, who were our arch enemies during the Second World War, and yet are now our strongest allies. Vietnam, I have not been back, but friends who have been back say that, first of all, a vast majority of the Vietnamese are under 25 and don't even remember the war. And American industry is operating in Vietnam, and the Vietnamese, according to those who have been there, are very friendly toward the Americans. So I think that's fine. It's not inevitable, but it's very, very valuable that we've had that change in attitude.
So did we lose that war?
We did not lose the war. The tragedy is that after we left, we did not provide the South Vietnamese with the support that we had promised them. A change in government in Washington, and we stopped doing what we had committed ourselves to do to assist the South Vietnamese. And the North Vietnamese seized on that, recognizing what had happened, that we were not going to provide the South Vietnamese with the support that we had committed ourselves to. And they, by 75, had fought essentially a traditional war. They invaded South Vietnam. It was not a revolution or an insurgency any longer. It was the North invading the South, and they defeated the South Vietnamese army. But there was not a single American unit in South Vietnam after 1973. So the United States, although we were supporting the South Vietnamese, were not physically present for that sad time.
It was a sad time. How did the State Department handle all the changes after Watergate? I mean, the politicizing went on in this country. That's probably the beginning of awareness for the public during the Watergate era. How did that affect the people who were in service that just kind of had to keep doing their job and keep going in spite of it?
Well, it didn't affect us too much at all, but a sad anecdote. As I said, I was back in South Vietnam reporting on the end of the war in 1973. And in 1973, I was attending the South Vietnamese military briefings every morning in Da Nang, that is for the northern part of South Vietnam. The chief of staff of what was called the 1st Military Corps, was a colonel who had been the chief of staff of the 1st Division while I was there earlier on. And he, at that time, had been a very anti-American officer. He required that I speak either Vietnamese or French to him. He wouldn't speak to me in English. In 1973, he was now the chief. He'd been promoted to be chief of staff of a much larger organization. And he was happy to talk to me in English. In fact, among the first things he said to me is, "Do you know where my son is going to school?" And I said, "No, sir, I don't know where he's going to school." "He's going to MIT. He's getting his PhD." And then a little later, he came to me again and said, Mr. Ambassador, he called me Ambassador, Mr. Ambassador, what is Watergate? And I tried to explain it as I understood it at the time to be a minor political imbroglio between the Democrats and the Republicans. And he said it will be the death of my country. What he meant, what I think he meant in retrospect, and which is true, is that Watergate so paralyzed the Republican administration, so empowered the Democrats, particularly in Congress, that our ability to assist the South Vietnamese was removed. I should say that was the basis for our inability to support the South Vietnamese. Now that's my particular point of view, but I reflect back on Colonel Quang's statement, Watergate will be the death of my country. And I've never forgotten that. The next assignment out of Washington was in Botswana, which is a lovely country in the southern part of Africa, and just north of South Africa. And I was the deputy ambassador and actually acting ambassador about half the time. And that's where we came to our faith strongly. We were in a small group around the Bishop of Botswana. The Anglican Bishop of Botswana was an American who had gone to UCLA at the same time I had, although we didn't know each other. But he was a strongly faithful, had a group of people from all over the world around him, South Africans, people from far away as Singapore and Kenya. And we would meet together for a social time and a prayer time on a Friday evening. And that really was strongly influenced Judy and me, and we came to faith at that time. So Botswana was a lovely place. And I should say, on behalf of Botswana, it's probably the most truly democratic country in Africa. And they're quite well off now with diamonds and other precious minerals. So we had a wonderful time there for 2 years.
And you raised some children there too.
Our children were just in their early teens, and they could ride their bicycles all over town. And we had good friends, and we got to do a lot of touristic traveling around Botswana. Beautiful game watching all over Botswana. So if you want to go to a place which has wonderful game viewing and is democracy, go to Botswana.
Now you have 3 children, correct?
Correct.
Did what you did for a living, did that influence what they chose for their professions?
Not finally. Our daughter, who lives not far from here, and who has a wonderful ministry that actually now is working with the RISE program at the church. Our number 2 is in Bermuda, working for what is called a reinsurance corporation. They insure insurance companies, and we're talking billions of dollars. He is their information and program officer and is doing very well. But Bermuda is a lovely place to spend some time. I'm not sure how long they want to stay there, but they're loving it now. And our youngest is, our younger son is a realtor in Vienna, Virginia, just close by. In fact, I had lunch with them yesterday. And they're all strong believers, and that was a part of their experience in Botswana. I should say, we had a miraculous healing in this group, this Friday evening prayer group. A wonderful British nurse in her 60s, suffering from severe arthritis, had to stop visiting the countryside to administer to the folks there. And our kids said, why don't we pray for Pippa? And of course we were concerned, well, if we pray for her and nothing happens, and what is that going to do? Well, we said yes, we would. So we circled Pippa one Friday evening and prayed and sang, and Pippa stood straight up, her hands straightened out. She leaped for joy, specifically. And so for our kids, the healing power of Christ is as real as electricity. You can't see it. You might get shocked by it a little bit. You can't see it, but it works, and you know it works by the results. And so the healing of Pippa, not everyone has that wonderful experience, but the healing of Pippa helped them solidified their faith, and ours too, as a matter of fact.
Well, when you experience it or see it or firsthand witness to those things, your life's never the same after that.
Never the same.
There's a responsibility to that experience too, isn't there?
Yeah.
To keep that faith strong.
Yeah.
So your wife and family are all veterans as well.
They are, and the kids all enjoyed their time, and they all remember it with with good joy. That their time in Botswana, their time in Nigeria later on, and our time in the Marshall Islands, where they were able to visit us also. But I think the most important place was Botswana.
Life-changing for the whole family.
Life-changing for the whole family.
Well, now we go to the Marshall Islands, and you got there in the 1980s, and under President Bush.
Reagan signed my commission. President Reagan, there's a picture in my office of shaking hands with him. The day I was commissioned, it was a very busy day. At 11 o'clock in the morning, we had a commissioning ceremony on the 8th floor of the State Department. And then we went over to the White House to have a picture taken with the President, which hangs in my office. And President Reagan's home, his ranch, was up above Santa Barbara.
Right.
And Judy went to the University of California, Santa Barbara. So the person who wrote the talking points for the President mentioned this, referred to this, and President Reagan, being who he was, used that information to have the most gracious pleasantries with Judy. But he was pleasant to the whole family. I should say that our older son was engaged at the time, and I called the White House and asked if his fiancée could join us, and they said of course. So we had not just the 5, but the 6th, who was with our son in Bermuda. And each one of them got a picture, a solo picture with the President, as well as a group picture, which they all cherish, of course. They all loved, and still do love, the memory of President Reagan.
How exciting.
Yes.
And you were the first ambassador to the Marshall Islands.
Not only was I the first ambassador, but I was the part of the negotiating team that completed the process of negotiating the relationship with the Marshall Islands. And I was on the team that briefed the Congress, both Senate and House, which was required in this unique situation. So I spent a lot of time preparing for the new relationship. And the Prime Minister of the Marshall Islands was in Washington with the team to brief the Congress, so that when I went out to the Marshall Islands to be the first ambassador, he was my dear friend. And so it was a wonderful time and a wonderful relationship. And I was privileged to be the first ambassador there.
Why is it important for a country our size and as prosperous as we are to have a relationship with a country that's so small and isolated from the rest of the world? Why is it important?
Well, it's unique in each case, but in the case of the Marshall Islands, there's no question. First of all, the Kwajalein Atoll is the home of what is called the Kwajalein Missile Range, where over the decades we have practiced shooting our ICBMs from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California to the huge lagoon, the huge lake, so to speak, and they land perfectly in the middle of that lagoon, and that proves the quality of our capability. While I was there, the Soviets had an electronic surveillance vessel just offshore, so they could monitor those shots. And I was always tickled to see them watching us providing such accurate use of our ICBMs. But Kwajalein was very important to us for our national. We also had very strong radar there that could protect us by providing early warning if the Soviets were to shoot off a missile toward us. So a very important area. Well, there's also Bikini Atoll, where we did our early testing of nuclear weapons. And the sad aftermath of that, even to this day, there are people who are suffering from the after effects. We did not know a lot about the significance of the fallout. Our own troops, our own Navy was within eyesight of Bikini. My son's father-in-law was a young officer in the Navy, and he remembers being on the deck of a vessel and with his shirt off, watching the explosion from not less than 20 miles away. And so he has suffered what he believes it must be some aftermath of that. What I'm saying is that although when we recognize the damage that we've caused, and we've paid millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars to try to rectify that, but they have suffered from that, and so that's still a very important part of our history of the Second World War and the aftermath of that.
Is there a trade and tourism relationship as well?
Well, they're too far away for a lot of tourism, but there is trade in the sense that they get most of their retail goods, their groceries and hardware and all this sort of thing, from Hawaii, which comes in on a boat regularly. We do our tuna fishermen in the south, in the far Pacific, often use them for supply and resupply and this sort of thing. But it's not a huge amount, and then, of course, it's a very small country, as you say, so there isn't a lot to be done there. But we also have a unique relationship, which means that we provide them with health care. Their education program is funded by us, and we use our expertise for that. And we even use, if necessary, FEMA will help if there's a destructive storm, for example. They'll
They're
come out
not
and
a
help.
territory.
They're not a territory. They're what is called freely associated. And it's a unique relationship, which we helped devise, which required, that's why it required both House and Senate to approve. That's why it required a plebiscite, a UN-monitored plebiscite, for them to approve the relationship. And we had to approve it in our Congress. And that relationship is unique. It allows the Marshallese to come to this country without a passport, and to stay permanently. And there are communities in California and Oklahoma, for example, where Marshallese operate. They have some very unique skills that they are in demand for, medical equipment, for example.
Well, with 3 consulates in the United States, one in Washington, one on the West Coast, and one in Springdale, Arkansas, of all places. Why would there be a consulate in Springdale, Arkansas?
Because of a small community of Marshallese there, that's right.
Fairly large community.
Well, yeah. For them, certainly.
Yeah.
And
they work in the chicken houses.
Yes.
Was that something the government helped in the relocation program?
No, this is their own. The relocation mainly has gone to Hawaii, and they have good communities in Hawaii too, of course.
And that's because of the nuclear.
Well, only in
there?
2 small islands, really, or 2 small atolls were affected by the nuclear testing. Most of the 22 atolls were not touched at all by it.
That had to be very exciting when you received that assignment.
Oh, it was. It was. It was an outgrowth, of course, of my assignment to the negotiating team, and a natural outcome of that, and we were tickled. In fact, Judy would have stayed there forever. I returned from the Marshall Islands and took a course, a 30-day course on how to be retired. The State Department's pretty good at that, in providing that, and then we were retired.
Now, in what year was that?
That was 1990.
1990. So
28 years ago. I've been retired almost as long as I've been in the service.
Had you had to work since? Have you done some?
Did a number of things. Did some training of Marshallese and others in diplomacy. I was the president of a small nonprofit organization called the Micronesia Institute, and we provided them with training in commerce and economics to help them with their trade and with business, and also with culture. For example, we brought some of their cultural groups to the United States, and one of them was at the Kennedy Center. We organized that. So it was, and that was several years. And then I worked for a very fine Christian foundation called the Mustard Seed Foundation. Financed by a member of the Falls Church, Anglican, very wealthy businessman who they gave a couple of $1 million a year to provide for Christian organizations around the world, in the United States particularly, but around the world, with small loans to help them with startup businesses. And I was the overseas person, and my favorite was the Burmese women, the minority women in Burma who were Christians, could buy a couple of goats or a sewing machine, and they could then create a small bank in-house for their community based upon the income that they received. That was my favorite grant, and that was for 3 years. And then very active in the church, called the Falls Church Anglican, during that entire time.
Now life is good on the lake. What do you like to do when you're not planning, strategizing, and being involved?
I'm still trying to organize all the files that I brought with me from 30 years in the diplomatic service.
Is there a book later on those information?
There could be, yeah. There could be.
It could be important to have that, Sam.
It would be. I must tell you, I agree with that, yeah.
One of the reasons for telling our stories is not only for you to get a chance to meet your neighbors, but it's also an opportunity for you to realize that American history needs to be preserved, and it's preserved through the stories of the people who created it. And I think that we've heard that today. Sam, I want to thank you so much for this opportunity. We could do this all afternoon and have a nice long visit. We're going to have to shut her down pretty quick here, but I just want to thank you for your time and your service. It's a pleasure serving you as a brother in the Lord, for one, together.
Amen.
But it's a pleasure knowing you as an American and as a new friend, and I appreciate you.
Well,
another good neighbor.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity.
You know, we can tell these stories all day long, and there's all kinds of stories, and you may have one that needs to be told. But one of the things that I always want to remind you of is that this is a sense of service that we have to our community. This is not about publicity or making one story better than another or trying to one-upmanship on somebody else. It's a story about people who live their lives with struggles and problems the same way every one of us go through, but they've overcome it for one reason or the other. We saw Guy Gardner a few weeks ago on his interview, and he talked about his time in space. And now we have a man who helped bring peace to the world after a terrible conflict that we were involved in, many of us firsthand. And now we see today the world that we live in. The conflicts that are resolved today are going to be resolved by you, by your good fortune, by your sense of servitude, and your love for your country. Let's just love each other for a little bit. And that's not some silly 60s things. That's something that's absolutely necessary. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, I want to thank you for being with us again. My name is Norm Allen. I'm looking forward to seeing you again very soon on another Meet Your Neighbor with the stories. Always all about you. We'll see you again soon.
This is the crew from the Flower Cottage. We are excited to support TV 18. We love life around the lake.
Welcome to Low Hair Studio. Hi, I'm Melissa.
And I'm Darlene.
We support Channel 18.
And we love life around the lake.
Fredericksburg Christian Health Center started back in 2003. We've been around for the last 13 years, and God has been amazingly faithful through that time. Because we had the word Christian in the title, there's a lot of Christians that look to us to provide their care, but we certainly provide care to people of other faiths as well. And so we welcome people of all faiths. As far as our insured patients, probably we have about 4,000, and then we probably have 1,000 to 1,500 uninsured patients. Yes, it does take quite a staff to do all that we do, and we have a tremendous staff. Not only do we have paid staff, but we also have volunteer staff, which helps us to be able to cut our costs a lot.
The staff in this clinic is an incredible team, and I do think that my military experience has helped and kind of helped improving and creating that team bond even more. we get together every morning as a team and go over the day, decide who's going to be working with who, what are the issues of the day that we may need to come up against if someone had called out sick or there's a computer problem, if there's especially complicated patients, and how we're going to work our day around those things. And then we also spend the morning praying together as a team, praying for us as a team, praying for the clinic, praying for our individual patients. We pray for our patients who we know are struggling with cancer or other serious illnesses, or have had family members who've passed away, or other issues like that. So I don't have a for-profit mindset into practicing medicine. And so when I'm taking care of people, it's strictly giving them the best care that I can.
We not only are looking at people's medical problems, but also getting to know them as people. And a lot of my patients have been with me for the last 20 years. And that's been such a blessing, and seeing not only, or seeing several generations of people. So I'll see kids, their parents, their grandparents, and that's just been a blessing to have those relationships over many years. I would hope that my patients, and I think that most of my patients, would say I get the best care in town. And I think that's because we do try to spend time with people. We do try to hear people. We're not trying to rush through a visit just to get to the next person. Those relationships that really matter in our day-to-day seeing patients. So in the years down the road, I really don't know what the clinic's going to look like. I think that we would like to be able to continue our mission of being able to provide care to the uninsured. And in addition to just caring for the normal physical health of the patients, we also are concerned about their emotional health as well as spiritual health. So there are times when people are going through crises, and they may want some spiritual support through that, and we offer them to pray with them if they would like to. Certainly as a staff, at times we will pray for patients at our morning prayer times. So I think one of the difficulties we've had over the years is getting the word out that we're here. I think as people discover who we are, there's some good support in the community, but most of our support has actually come from Mary Washington Hospital. They see that we help to provide a service to people who couldn't ordinarily afford care, and so they're willing to come alongside us and help us with that. Unfortunately, over the last year, some of that support has had to be cut because their own funding has not been as good as they would like. There are a few churches in the area that do help to support us, and we're grateful for that. And there's some individuals also that help to support us.
Ultimately, we are completely in God's hands, and we're operating by the grace of God. So there's so many factors, in terms of the nationwide politics and, what health insurance is going to look like that could affect our mission. And funding is a big part as well. We recently lost a very large amount of the funding grant money that we used to be getting. And so right now is a time that we're really relying on God, day by day.
Well, I think it's vital over the coming months and years that we do find other sources of funding, people who do believe in our mission to provide for those who can't afford care. And so I think partnering with businesses, partnering with other churches, we can't do this on our own. Whether you know it or not, there are people in your church, most likely, who come to our clinic we're taking care of those people. We need your prayers. None of this can work without God. Every year we see that played out. And we need our community, and you're part of that.
see the sunshine getting ready to come through those clouds any minute now. I can see all my obstacles. They're going to get out of my way. They are. I got the power and the ability to think myself through a lot of things, but I tell you, I got to depend on other things. And I know that He's going to give it to me. Because